Let's start again.
The urgent search in Madison, Wisconsin for a 23-year-old woman on the run. Morgan Geyser, an attacker behind the 2014 stabbing. Madison police say Geyser cut off her ankle.
Welcome back, Cryptivists. Today we're diving into a topic that, in a lot of ways, mirrors the Backrooms in origin. If the Backrooms was a location that escaped the internet, this was the monster who did it first. You see, the internet has made countless ghost stories. However, very few breach into the real world. This one, however, there was a brief moment where people forgot it wasn't real. Let us delve into the archive for the lost horror icon that is the Slender Man. The year is 2009. Barack Obama had just entered the White House. Minecraft was still a niche indie project. YouTube was just only a few years old, and most people still experienced the internet from a desktop computer tucked away in the corner of the family room. The online world was a very different place. It felt less like a city and more like a collection of strange neighborhoods. Most people had never heard of Reddit, let alone the countless niche forums scattered across the web. And absolutely nobody had heard of a tall man in a black suit with no face. This was about to change. And strangely enough, it all started with a Photoshop contest on a forum called Something Awful. In my last video, we discussed 4chan and its importance to the Backrooms. Much like that story, Something Awful is integral to the Slender Man mythos. However, it's important to understand that 4chan and Something Awful could not have been more different. You see, 4chan thrived on anonymity and rapid-fire posts. Threads came and went in the matter of hours, sometimes minutes. Something Awful, on the other hand, was a traditional forum. Users had accounts, discussions could last for days, and communities formed around shared interests. It was less chaotic, but no less influential. In fact, many of the internet's most recognizable memes and cultural touchstones can trace their roots back to these very forums. And that distinction is important. The Backrooms was discovered by the internet and then expanded on by a community. Slender Man was almost the reverse. It was deliberately created by a community and then escaped into the wider internet. And now that we understand the kind of community Something Awful fostered, we can finally return to that Photoshop contest. The challenge was simple: create a convincing paranormal image. Among the dozens of submissions, one was from a user named Eric Noonston, or known online at the time as Victor Surge. At the time, it looked no different than any other entry, a pair of edited photographs, accompanied with a few lines of text.
We didn't want to go. We didn't want to kill them. 14 children vanished. A fire in the library occurred 1 week later.
A tall man, a black suit, and no face. This marked the first appearance of Slender Man. To me, what's fascinating isn't that the Slender Man appeared in this thread. It's that nobody reading it knew they were witnessing the birth of an internet legend. To them, it was simply another image in the Photoshop contest, one among dozens. Yet within a few hours, people wanted more. And more is exactly what they got. What began as a pair of edited photographs quickly evolved into something larger. Other users started contributing their own stories, images, and interpretations. Victor Surge himself continued expanding on the myth, posting additional photographs and fragments of lore. The figure in the background was no longer a clever Photoshop creation. He was becoming a character, a mystery, a shared story that everyone could contribute to. And perhaps that's what made Slender Man so different from many of the horror icons that came before him. He didn't belong to a movie studio. He didn't belong to a publisher. He belonged to the internet. And thousands of people added their own pieces to the puzzle. The myth continued to grow. As this community began building, new details started to emerge. One of the earliest and most influential add-ons came from a user named Guyvermac, a post that would add something Slender Man desperately needed: a history. While contributing to the growing mythos, Guyvermac introduced the idea of Der Ritter. This roughly translated to the Night. Presented as an old historical illustration, the image suggests that Slender Man had existed long before the original photographs appeared online. This was a major turning point in the creature's evolution. Up until this point, Slender Man had been little more than a disturbing figure lurking in a handful of edited photographs. Now, he had a past. A presence that seemed to stretch back through the centuries. And with that, creators began interpreting the character in their own ways. Some called him Slender Man, others chose to use Der Ritter. The details varied, but the idea remained the same. A tall figure lurking just beyond the edge of perception, watching, waiting, and growing with every new contribution. Which led me to a question. Why this monster? Of all the creatures the internet has created, why was this one the one that resonated with so many people? And with that, I started digging for answers. And every path seemed to lead to the very same destination: the Uncanny Valley. As mammals, humans are hardwired to recognize familiar patterns. Faces, body language, or posture, our brains are continuously collecting information about those around us, often without us even realizing it. It's an instinct that has helped us survive for thousands of years. So what happens when you take those signals away? Slender Man has no face, no expression, no eyes to meet yours, no emotion to read. Your brain immediately begins searching for information that simply isn't there. And while it's trying to make sense of the figure before it, another detail emerges: the suit. Formal attire is something we subconsciously associate with professionalism, authority, and normalcy. It suggests safety when everything else is screaming the opposite. And then there's the height, the impossibly tall frame, the unnaturally thin proportions, human enough to recognize, wrong enough to fear. Every feature sends a different message, forcing your brain to reconcile a contradiction it was never designed to process. The result is a perfect storm of uncertainty, and uncertainty is fertile ground for fear. This combination proved remarkably effective. And before long, the internet wanted to see what happened when Slender Man stepped out of a photograph and into motion. People wanted to know how he moved. What happens when he isn't standing perfectly still in the background? And in 2009, a group of college friends set out to answer those very questions. The project was called Marble Hornets, and in many ways, it would become just as important to Slender Man's success as the original photographs themselves. And the premise was deceptively simple. A student filmmaker named Alex Crawley had been working on a movie called Marble Hornets. But as the production continued, his behavior became increasingly strange and more erratic. Eventually, the project was abandoned altogether. Months later, another filmmaker named Jay received a box of tapes from Alex. Unsure of what had happened, he began uploading the footage to YouTube. At least, that was the story. In reality, Marble Hornets was a fictional web series presented as if it was real found footage. And that distinction is important, because unlike a photograph, footage feels authentic. A photograph can be edited, a story can be written, but a video feels like evidence. As viewers watched the tapes, strange details began to emerge. Missing time, distorted audio, unexplained figures standing in the distance, and lurking on the edge of a frame was a familiar silhouette. Tall, thin, faceless. For the first time, audiences weren't reading about Slender Man. They were watching him, and the internet couldn't get enough. Over the next years, Slender Man exploded into the mainstream. What began as a Photoshop contest entry evolved into one of the internet's first truly global horror phenomenons. Story, artwork, videos, games, entire communities formed around this faceless figure in the suit. Slender Man was no longer confined to forums and creepypasta websites. He was everywhere. In 2012, another major piece of the puzzle arrived. A free indie game called Slender, the 8 Pages. The premise was also incredibly simple. Explore a dark forest and collect 8 scattered pages while avoiding Slender Man. Each page increased the tension. The music grew louder, the static intensified, and the creature stalking you became increasingly more aggressive. It was simple, it was terrifying, and it was exactly the kind of experience YouTube had been waiting for. I still remember playing it with my friends in high school, watching a new generation of creators like Markiplier and PewDiePie scream their way through the woods. For many people, this wasn't their first encounter with Slender Man, but it was the moment they finally met him. And once again, the legend grew. Now, every story in the archive has an ending. Some are good, some are bad, and some remind us that stories have consequences. Slender Man's rise seemed unstoppable, but at the height of its popularity, reality began to blur with fiction. And that is exactly where our bad ending begins. On May 31st, 2014, Slender Man found himself in the center of an international news story. In Waukesha, Wisconsin, 2 12-year-old girls carried out a violent attack against a friend. According to the investigators, they believed the act would prove their loyalty to Slender Man. Suddenly, that character born from a Photoshop contest wasn't being discussed on forums and YouTube channels anymore. He was appearing on television news broadcasts around the world. For years, Slender Man has existed in a space most people rarely paid attention to. Internet forums, creepypasta websites, YouTube series, gaming communities. Overnight, that changed. Parents who had never heard of the name suddenly wanted answers. Journalists began investigating the internet horror, and for the first time, people began asking questions that still sparks debates today. Can a fictional story be responsible for real-world actions? The answer, of course, is far more complicated than a simple yes or no. Mental health professionals, investigators, and the courts would ultimately point to factors far deeper than a horror story posted online. But regardless of where one stands on that debate, the cultural impact was undeniable. Slender Man's image had become so widespread, so recognizable, that many people struggled to separate the myth from the headlines. The monster had escaped the internet, just not in the way anyone had intended. In the years that followed, Slender Man's popularity began to cool. Like many internet phenomenon, what was once fresh had become familiar. New stories emerged, new horror icons appeared, and gradually, the faceless figure that had once dominated forums, channels, and communities began to fade from the spotlight. Yet, unlike most internet horror stories, Slender Man never truly disappeared. After all, how many internet creations can claim the same legacy? A Photoshop contest entry, a community-built mythology, a widely built successful web series, best-selling games, books, merchandise, and eventually a Hollywood film. For something that began as a few edited photographs on an obscure internet forum, that's a remarkable journey. The more I researched Slender Man, the less he felt like an internet creation, and the more he felt like something much older. Every generation has its monsters, creatures that lurk beyond the edge of civilization, figures whispered around campfires, warnings passed from one person to another. The details change, but the idea remains the same. Slender Man wasn't the first monster humanity created, but he may have been the first born entirely online. And against all odds, he escaped. And perhaps that's why we're still talking about him today. Not because he was real, but for a brief moment, the internet succeeded at creating something that felt real enough. A modern myth for a digital age. If you enjoyed today's topic, consider subscribing. I'd love to see you around the archive, yeah? In my last video, I featured a challenge to describe the most liminal space you've ever been a part of, and I would choose your comment and read it. The cryptivist that caught my eye was Visual Den Studios, and their post was as follows. An abandoned 3-story rice factory we explored as kids. It had these massive ceilings, towering machines, and giant industrial hoppers that went down into pitch black. It was a mix of liminal space and megalophobia, as I stood near those hoppers. I think that is a truly terrifying visual, especially when you're chaining together phobias like that. I appreciate your submission, and please, be careful when looking down next time you visit that complex. Now it's your turn. What internet horror story scared you the most growing up? And most importantly, why did it scare you? Was it Slender Man, Ben Drown, Jeff the Killer, or something entirely different? Tell me below, and if your story catches my eye, I'll feature it in the next video just like this one. Until the next broadcast, I wish you a good